Welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this tutorial episode, I'm going to explain how to create the crow artwork that I did. In the video, there will be terms I use like circular motion and zigzag strokes. If you're not familiar with my terminology, I have a video that explains them, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. Well, let's get burning. We will begin by burning in the trace lines with a writer pen tip. Burn the lines no darker than a medium tan color. Our goal is to be able to see the burned in lines, but once the area is shaded, the lines should not be noticeable, so you don't want them too dark. After the lines are burned in, rub a pencil eraser over the area to remove any residual graphite. I did not record that step. Head and neck. Use a white charcoal pencil and color in the reflection on the eye. Then use a writer pen tip and burn in the eye, but avoid burning over the white charcoal. Afterwards, erase the charcoal and use a shader to burn darkly under the lower eyelid. Extend the color to the beak. I burned a series of vertical lines and then reburned over the area to darken and extend the color. Also, burn some dark, thick, short, semi-vertical lines under the eyelid. Burn in a little of the area below the dark lines. Extend the color at the corner of the eye onto the beak. Darkly burn along the forehead next to the beak. In this area, I am once again burning a series of vertical lines. Then, darken the area around the eyelids. Rotate the board as needed so your pen tip stays in optimal position. While the board is rotated, burn along the seam where the beak and the forehead touch. Then burn next to the light band on the edge of the upper beak. Now we are going to start blocking in feather groups and defining the edges of those feather groups. I will be jumping around to different areas on the face as I do this. When I block in a feather group, I tend to use the flat of the shader, whereas I use the razor edge of the shader when I'm defining the edges of a group. The reason is that I want the edges to be jagged or to look like they are composed of lots of individual hairs. That type of texture is replicated better by using the razor edge of the shader, or you could use a writer pen tip. It is important to rotate the board as needed while you work so the pen tip stays in optimal position. This will ensure the edges of the beak are clean and clearly defined. This is something I often refer to as crisp lines. Now we will concentrate on the lower beak and chin area. The lower beak is pretty dark, but there is a highlight near the right upper edge. The last row of feathers on the chin are slightly darker than the beak is. With the upper beak, make sure to burn it dark enough that the trace line blends in. I ended up burning the beak darker than the reference photo just to make sure it stood out from the unburned background. Sometimes, when you view your art at different angles, you will notice something isn't quite right. That's what happened with the upper edge or contours of the beak. I'm fixing that and darkening up the back half of it. The head is covered with short feathers that resemble hair. On the forehead, these feathers are a bit ruffled. To replicate that look, I am burning a bunch of short lines that vary in thickness. The lines should be burned in the direction that the feathers are growing. Along the top of the head, the feathers smooth out, so I switched to uniform strokes for that area. I also reburned over the forehead with really short zigzags to darken it up. Make sure to burn a couple of lines beyond the edge of the head to help give it that ruffled look. I burned a line too dark, so I'm using the edge of a knife to gently scrape away my mistake. Now use the flat of the shader and burn long, gently curving bands of color that follow the contours of the head. This will start to give shape to the head. Also, burn over the eyelids. The upper eyelid is darker than the lower one. Well, it's probably just in shadow, so appears darker. Next, darken up the feathers just above the eye. Then resume burning in the smooth feathers on the head. This section of the video is slightly out of focus, so my apologies for that. Now start defining the edges of the feather groups and burning in the shadows on the face. You are going to need to consult with the reference photo often for this. I am using uniform strokes on the top and side of the head where the feathers are smoother and mostly the same color. I used pull-away strokes on the throat. With the throat, the feather groups are dark, but the outer edges of each group tend to be a couple of shades lighter. So start the stroke on the dark inner edge and pull it towards the light outer edge. Another thing about the throat feathers is that they are a bit ruffled. This means that the outer edge of each feather group needs some hairs that stick out onto the adjacent group. This is similar to what we did with the forehead. Add some texture to the feathers on the side and back of the head. Do this by burning an assortment of short and medium-length lines and bands of color. Darken up the reflection on the eye, and then fine-tune the reflection on the lower beak. It might be easier to use a writer pen tip on the dark edge of the beak. Burn really dark under the lower eyelid. Plus, make the eyelid thinner. Lastly, fine-tune the reflection. I made a circular reflection that is flanked by two smaller and darker spots on the side. Burn darkly over the pattern lines on the neck. Now fill the area between those lines with an assortment of lighter colored lines. I am burning pull-away strokes for this, but I'm using the edge of the shader so the lines are thinner. I am not trying to create an exact replica of the photo. Instead, I am making sure the lines are being burned in the direction the feathers are growing. Also, I am trying to make sure that the major shadows are in their proper place. For example, there are dark shadows under the last feather group on the face. A green arrow is pointing to the spot. The throat is in shadows, so it should be darker than the rest of the neck. I do want to point out that as I work in this area, I am very careful to leave a few lines here and there that are paler in color. These paler lines really help give shape to the area. Once the neck is blocked in, it is a matter of reburning over the area to increase the contrast and the overall darkness levels. Plus, the shadows and highlights need to be fine-tuned. The majority of my time reburning was spent adding a lot more lines into the area. As more lines get added, the overall color will become darker. I do want to mention that I am burning individual lines. The lines vary in color, length, and thickness. Also, I am placing the lines so that they break up larger clumps of hair. I look at the artwork and carefully choose where I am burning in a new line. In areas that need to get darker, I add more lines. Upper wing and back. We will begin with the first row of feathers adjacent to the neck. I mark the area with a yellow circle. There are a number of dark shadows in this area. The easiest way to tackle it is by working on one feather at a time. Begin by examining the reference photo to determine the shadow placement. Then replicate what you see. After the shadow is burned in, then burn over the rest of the feather. For a lot of the feathers in this area, I used pull-away strokes as my burn method. Start the stroke in the dark shadow and pull the pen tip down towards the bottom of the feather. Now burn in the dark shadows on the back. Again, you will need to consult with the reference photo often during this step to see which feathers have shadows under them. Once the shadows are burned in, then start burning in the feathers. Burn each one individually. The majority of the feathers are darker near the base of each feather. They also tend to be lighter at the outer ends. As you get closer to the belly or the chest area, the feathers are darker overall. Some of the shadows on the back and upper wing are not very pronounced. It might be easier to burn them in with a writer pen tip like I am doing in the video. Then switch back to a shader pen tip to burn in each feather. As I said before, I am predominantly using pull-away strokes as my burn method for the feathers. Pull-away strokes start darker than they end, so they provide gradient shading. Since a lot of the feathers are a touch lighter at their outer ends, the pull-away strokes are a good match to replicate this. I do not have any tricks or tips to speed up burning in the feathers. Pyrography is not a fast art form. This crow took me over 8 hours to create. The board is only 8 by 10 inches, and there is a fair amount of space around the crow. So don't rush things. Quality art takes time. As I cannot think of anything useful to say, I will play some music until we get to the wing feathers that I have marked with a circle. Burn in the shadows along the left edge of the feathers. If it is easier, use a writer pen tip for this. Then switch to a shader and burn in the feathers individually. I am using uniform strokes for this, but I also used a little circular motion. If you are not familiar with my terminology, I do have a video that explains them, and I will put a link to that in the description below. Reburn over the back feathers as needed to darken up any that are too light in color. With this first feather, the top or base is lighter than the end of the feather. Plus, the feather is a bit bowed or curved, so the edges are slightly darker than the center. Most of these wing feathers are slightly tattered or jagged on the left edge. To replicate that, burn a number of short, dark, single lines along that left edge. Burn in each feather individually, just like we have done with all of the feathers on the back. Consult with the reference photo before starting a new feather. You should be looking for anything that makes the feather unique. If there isn't anything, then burn the feather similar to the way that we have burned the first one. The end of the feather is darker than the base, the edges are slightly darker than the center, and the left edge is just a bit jagged. It is up to you on whether or not you want to do all of the steps for one feather and then move on to the next feather, or if you would prefer to do one step on all or a few of the feathers, then do the second step, and so on. Either way will produce great results. I continue to use uniform strokes and circular motion for my burn methods on the feather. Also, I use the razor edge of the shader when burning in the single lines along the left edge. Sometimes I will use a zigzag type of stroke when burning along that left edge because it produces similar results. Burn in the shadows on the belly or chest of the crow. Keep your pen tip in optimal position when burning along the outer edge of the bird. Rotate the board if necessary. The outer edge along the belly or chest area should be very dark in color. Continue burning in the dark shadows along the belly. The entire belly area is darker in color than the back, so burn these shadows to a dark brown or black color. The shadows under the wing feathers get thicker or wider as you get closer to the bottom edge of the feathers. A yellow arrow is pointing to the spot. I am predominantly using pull-away strokes for the feathers on the belly. The stroke starts in the shadows and gets pulled towards the opposite side of the feather. Slightly overlapping the strokes will give you a smoother burn result. I often burn in some feathers and then assess them to see how the contrast and overall darkness is compared to adjacent feathers. Often, I will reburn over some of those feathers and or the adjacent feathers that I think need a little fine-tuning. I recommend that you do the same thing. Lower wing and tail. Once again, we will begin with the shadows. The shadow I am currently working on is pretty substantial and very dark, so it will get burned to a dark brown or black color. Burn the shadow on the tail feather to the same color, but be aware that the left edge of the tail feathers are a few shades lighter, so don't burn the shadow as a solid dark mass. Start to block in the dark shadow on the rump. We will finish this area later. With these left wing feathers, burn them in to give them a base color. Make sure the lines between the feathers are dark enough to still be visible. Also, leave the left edge a touch lighter in color. I am using uniform strokes for the majority of my burning, but I do occasionally use some circular motion. With this long wing feather, I find it is easier to rotate the board and burn up to the pale edge. This direction keeps the pen tip in optimal position, and it makes it easier to see how close to the edge you are getting. Now that the edge of the highlight is defined, darken the feather up to that edge, then reburn over the shorter feathers to darken them up. I am using a lot of circular motion and some uniform strokes for this. You probably noticed already that I tend to do a lot of reburning. I often block in areas and then reburn over them several times while working on a project. This approach allows me to take breaks from groups of feathers and then return to them later on with fresh eyes. I often notice small details I didn't really see before, or it could be that the artwork wasn't far enough along to worry about those details yet. These top feathers on the wing are the lightest in color. Most of them are not clearly defined, so don't get carried away with fine details in this area. The next two feathers have some wavy spots or depressions that are shadowed. Begin by blocking in the shadows on those depressions. Then, burn over the lighter areas and blend the transitions between the light and dark areas. Reburn as needed until you are happy with how the feather looks. Then repeat this process on the second wavy feather. As you can see, the process does not have to be done in the exact same order. The important thing is to consult with the reference photo often so that you are placing the depressions in their correct spot. The lower wing feathers are gently curving down over the body, so they are not receiving direct sunlight like the top feathers are. Because of this, these feathers are darker. As you burn them in, make sure to burn them a couple of shades darker than the top feathers. Also, make sure they are a number of shades lighter than the dark shadow that is below the wing. I continue to use circular motion and uniform strokes as my burn method. Plus, I reburn over the area several times as I slowly build up the color. Keep in mind that I am not saying you have to do things the same way. Nor am I saying that my method is the best method. Instead, I am just explaining how I do things. Dark shadows are under the end of the middle wing feathers. The shadows fade a short distance from those feathers. This group of feathers curves downward along the sides of the body. The lower side of the feathers that the yellow arrow is pointing at is considerably darker than the upper edge. So burn that lower edge a few shades darker than the upper one. These two wing feathers are a bit darker than the group we were working on, and I'm going to burn them a touch darker than the reference photo shows. As always, rotate the board as needed so your pen tip stays in optimal position when working along edges. This will keep those edges crisp and clean. Burn in the two feathers. I tend to block in areas with a fairly uniform color and then reburn to darken and give the area shape. As I already stated, I will be burning these two feathers darker than what the reference photo shows. Once the adjacent feathers are burned in, finish burning in the curving feathered group. Make sure that the top edge of this curving group is lighter in color than the two adjacent feathers. You may have noticed that sometimes I burn down the length of the feather and other times I burn in a horizontal direction. The reason is that the grain lines on this board are running horizontally. So sometimes I burn in that direction to darken up an area between two of those grain lines. We will begin working on the tail by burning in the shadows. Just like before, rotate the board as needed to keep your pen tip in optimal position when burning along edges. With the edge of the feathers and the shadows defined, burn in each feather individually. The first couple of tail feathers have a cast shadow on them from the wing, so make sure to burn in that shadow. Consult with the reference photo often to make sure you put the shadows where they should be. Periodically, evaluate your work and fine-tune any feathers as needed. I continue to use circular motion and uniform strokes as my burn method for the feathers, but feel free to use the burn method of your preference. It takes a number of reburnings to build up the color to the level it should be. Also, I want to mention that I did not adjust the heat setting on my burner while working on the crow. Instead, I adjusted how fast I moved my hand. Slowing down your hand speed results in a darker burn. Speeding up your hand speed produces a lighter burn. Combine your hand speed with reburning, and you can create any hue of brown, even dark browns and black colors, using a medium to low setting on your burner. The shadows on the tail got a bit lost during the burning and reburning process, so I am fixing that. I rotated the board so my pen tip would be in optimal position as I burn along the lower edge of the shadows. One of the last things I did on the tail was add some dark lines here and there that angle downward. These replicate the texture that I see on a couple of the feathers. Now it is time to burn in the couple of small feathers at the top of the tail and do any fine-tuning on the tail. This probably will not be a surprise, but I used circular motion and uniform strokes as my burn method on these feathers. Rump and legs. The couple of feathers behind the leg are similar in color to the tail feathers. Also, the lower edge of the rump feathers need to be jagged or hairy in appearance. Make sure to burn some dark bands of color that taper to a point in this area. Some of that I already did while I was working on the tail feathers. I am burning pull-away strokes to give the lower edge that jagged or hairy appearance. When I near the end of the stroke, I quickly lift the pen tip up and away from the board. This gives me a tapered edge on that burn stroke that comes to a point. You might have noticed some smoke coming from my pen tip. I turned up the heat on my burner. The rump has a lot of really dark areas. I didn't want to spend a long time reburning over and over to get the dark color that I needed. As you can see, I have not created an exact replica of the photo, and that's okay because the photo is just a guideline to help create the artwork. Very few, if any, people will examine your artwork that closely. The back leg is mostly in shadows, but there is a thin band of reflected light along the front of the leg. Block in the shadow. Then rotate the board if needed and burn along the front edge of the leg. Don't burn it too dark. Afterwards, fine-tune the shadow at the top of the leg. Also, burn along the front edge of the other leg. Finish burning in the shadow on the back leg. Note that the shadow is slightly darker just above the toe. A yellow arrow is pointing to the spot. With this shadow, I tap and pause the pen tip to burn it in darkly. Fill the toe with color and then reburn over the bottom half of it to darken it up. Now finish the back toe. Make sure to leave the toe pad a shade or two lighter than the side of the toe. A yellow arrow is pointing to the toe pad. Next, do any fine-tuning that is needed to the leg to finish it up. Block in the shadows on the front leg. This leg is not as darkly shadowed as the back one, so we see a bit more detail on this leg. For example, there is a shadow on the toe just behind the ankle. We see two toe pads along the bottom of the toe. There are little shadows under the front toe. There is a highlight on the side of the ankle. I can keep pointing out details, but at some point you have to ask yourself, do I need to replicate every detail in the photo? No. The more you include, the more realistic the artwork looks, but unless you're trying to achieve photorealism, I would not worry about every little detail. Instead, just cover the major ones that give the leg and foot shape. And those I already pointed out, and a few extra to boot. The perch. The last thing we need to do is the perch. I recommend using the largest shader you have for this, or using the long side edge versus the front edge of the shader you do have if it's not very large. For this driftwood or this old barkless log, I am burning zigzags. The zigzags need to be burned in the direction that the tree grows. If this tree was still upright, the zigzags would be burned in a vertical direction. As I am burning, I am working my way down the log. I make sure to leave gaps here and there in the burn strokes. Also, I work in small sections at a time. Often, I will put in a base layer of texture and then reburn over that area to darken and emphasize any cracks. I am not trying to replicate the reference photo. Instead, I am creating a rustic type of texture that I hope will be interpreted as being an old log. I plan to gradually increase the darkness of the log as I work my way across it. Or to put it another way, I plan to create a bit of gradient shading to make the log appear rounded. So the front edge of the log should be lighter than the back. The front edge is the edge that the feet are clinging to. Occasionally, you will see that I'm burning in a vertical direction. During those times, I am creating uniform color to fill in areas. One major key to this texture I am creating is tonal variety. Create really pale burn lines. Create really dark burn lines. And create a large variety in between those two. Burn in some dark, curving lines to represent cracks. Cluster several cracks together. Make some cracks long and others short. This is all part of that variety which is needed for this type of texture. Just like all burn methods, you can alter the darkness level of your burn results by how fast you move your hand. For areas I want really dark, I slow down my hand speed. I also use reburning to increase the darkness levels. I do recommend rotating the board to see if burning in a different direction is easier to do. Even though I'm burning zigzags, I am not using the razor edge of the shader. The combination of zigzags with the razor edge of the shader is how I create fur texture. I don't want this log to look like fur, so I'm using the flat of the shader as I burn. I switched to a smaller shader to work around the feet, as the smaller shader makes it easier to be precise and avoid the toes. There wasn't enough contrast between the log and the tail feathers, so I'm reburning over the tail to fix that. To increase the contrast between the log and the tail even more, I am erasing over the log near the tail. I'm using a spot sanding pen, but you can also use sandpaper or even an ink pen eraser for this. The last thing I did was reburn over the log where I wanted it to appear in shadows. Well, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you found it useful and will try it yourself. On my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have the written version of the tutorial, a pattern, and the reference photo for your use. Well, thank you so much for watching my video, and I will see you next week.